picture this. 1920s New York City.
Oh, yeah.
The Jazz Age.
The Roaring Twenties.
Yeah, flapper dresses, speakeasies, like that sense of like excitement and possibility in the air, right?
Yeah.
But over in Queens, in a quiet neighborhood, a very different story is unfolding.
Okay.
A story about a couple, Ruth and Albert Snyder.
Right.
They lived what seemed to be a pretty normal life. He was a magazine editor. They had a young son.
Right.
But under the surface, Ruth, she wanted more. She longed for more excitement, more glamour, what the Roaring Twenties kind of promised.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And this led her to, an affair with Judd Gray, a corset salesman.
Okay.
Now, this affair, it was passionate, it was intense, but it was also like a ticking time bomb.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, and it eventually exploded in a crime that would shock the nation.
Wow.
Welcome to CrimePod Castle's Twisted Crime series.
This is a story that I think almost 100 years later, it still fascinates us. Because it's about love and betrayal, and it's about this darker side to the American dream.
Yeah, it's like we're looking back in time through a cracked window.
Yeah.
We can see those glimmers of hope and progress.
Yeah.
But there's also those shadows,
Right.
secrets and lies, and that potential for, violence lurking underneath.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And with Ruth and Albert Snyder, those shadows eventually consumed them entirely.
They did.
So let's start with their marriage.
Okay.
What do we know about how their relationship worked? Like, what clues can we find in their story that might explain the tension that led to this tragic outcome?
Well, from what I've read, their marriage, it was full of contrast.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Albert, he was still grieving his first fiancée who had died years earlier, and he seemed, stuck in the past. Yeah, he had this traditional view of marriage and family, and he was described as stoic, frugal, and maybe not fully aware of just how unhappy Ruth was.
That's interesting that he was, still mourning this past love while being married to Ruth.
Right.
It makes you think maybe there wasn't really a strong connection between them.
Yeah, like a part of him was still with that past love,
Right.
And then you have Ruth wanting something more than just, being a housewife.
Yeah.
She craved excitement and attention. I think she saw that in Judd Gray.
Yeah, and it's important to remember this was the 1920s.
It was.
Things were changing.
A lot of change.
Women had just gotten the right to vote.
Yeah.
The flapper movement was challenging traditional ideas about what it meant to be a woman.
And a lot of women, like Ruth, they felt stifled. They wanted more out of life.
Exactly. It was a time of liberation, but also immense pressure.
Absolutely.
So for Ruth, this disillusionment and her wanting a more exciting life, well, it made her vulnerable to someone like Judd Gray, who represented, everything that Albert wasn't.
Right. He was this charming, smooth-talking, the kind of guy who knew how to appeal to a woman's desires.
Yeah. I mean, from everything I've read, Judd was a master manipulator,
Yeah.
Really good at seduction.
Yeah, showered her with attention and compliments and promises of a life full of, excitement and luxury, the complete opposite of her life with Albert.
Right. And for Ruth, wanting that forbidden fruit, Judd must have been intoxicating.
Oh, yeah.
But, their affair, built on secrets and lies, well, it was bound to fall apart.
It was.
And it did, with terrible consequences. But before we get into the crime itself, let's talk about the psychology of this love triangle for a minute. What do you think drove Ruth and Judd to such extremes?
Right.
I mean, was it just passion and greed, or was there something, deeper going on?
Yeah, it's a question that's fascinated people for decades.
It has.
On the surface, it looks like a typical love triangle gone wrong, but I think there's more to it than that.
I agree. There's a desperation, almost a recklessness in their actions that suggests something darker, something more complex was happening underneath.
Right, like their desires, this mix of passion and ambition and maybe even some delusion just spiraled out of control and they couldn't stop it.
Exactly, and that's how we get to March 20th, 1927.
Yeah, that's when everything changed.
That's the day the simmering tension boils over and leads to this shocking act of violence.
Right, the day that would change their lives forever.
That's when everything falls apart and we see just how brutal people can be.
So let's break down what happened that night. What clues can we find in those details that tell us about what Ruth and Judd were thinking?
Okay, well, according to court records and what the newspapers wrote, it all started with a plan.
A plan?
Yeah, a plan that shows just how desperate they were to escape their lives.
This is where things get really interesting, where we start to peel back the layers of deception and see the cracks in their facade.
Right, let's dive into those details and try to understand what pushed them to cross that line from fantasy into, well, a terrifying reality.
Okay, let's do that.
That night, Ruth told Albert she had a surprise for him, so she got him to, lay down, be vulnerable.
Wow, can you imagine, like, that trust Albert must have felt, and then to have that shattered?
It shows just how deep the deception went, how manipulative their relationship had become.
It's chilling.
And while Albert was lying there, Judd, who had been hiding in the house, he comes out and attacks him.
My God.
Yeah, hits him over and over with this sash weight.
A sash weight?
Yeah, like the heavy thing used for window counterweights.
Right, right.
That detail always gets me. Like, that wasn't something they just, grabbed in the heat of the moment. It means they planned it. It's cold, calculated, just awful.
It makes it so much more brutal. It wasn't just like a crime of passion.
Exactly. This was planned out. They wanted Albert gone. They wanted to start their new life together.
But, for all their planning, it wasn't very well thought out.
No.
The whole trying to make it look like a robbery, it fell apart pretty quickly.
Right. I mean, classic amateur mistakes.
Like what?
Well, the robbery note they wrote, it was just bad. And Ruth, she kept changing her story. And then, of course, they found Judd's tie.
His tie.
Yeah, at the crime scene with his initials on it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so much for a random robbery.
It's like they thought they could just pretend Albert never existed and no one would notice.
Right. It's fascinating from a psychological perspective.
What do you mean?
Well, they were so focused on what they wanted, so caught up in their own lies that they didn't grasp the reality of the situation, how serious it was.
Like they were living in a fantasy world.
Yeah, and that's the thing about reality. It always catches up to you.
That's for sure.
And for Ruth and Judd, reality came crashing down hard.
It did?
The evidence was just too strong. They didn't have anywhere to hide.
So what happened then? Did they confess? Did they turn on each other?
Well, as the pressure mounted, they did start to crack.
Oh, I bet.
Facing the possibility of being hanged, suddenly they weren't so united anymore.
Every man for himself, right?
Exactly. All that talk of love and being trapped and this evil husband, well, it all went out the window.
Because they were scared.
Terrified. And their confessions, well, they were full of accusations, each trying to make themselves look less guilty.
Wow, so the love story was over.
Oh, yeah. By the time the trial started, it was all about survival.
And that trial, it became a huge media spectacle.
Oh, yeah. The newspapers loved it.
Why do you think that is? Like, why did this case capture the public's imagination so much?
Well, I think part of it was the time period, the roaring 20s, everything was changing. There was this clash between the old ways and the new ways.
Right, like the flapper movement, the speakeasies, people pushing the boundaries.
Exactly. And I think Ruth and Judd's story with the affair and the violence, it kind of tapped into the anxieties people were feeling,
Well, like it was a sign of how society was falling apart.
Maybe. And the media, they knew that. They played it up, turned this murder case into something much bigger.
And Ruth, with her style and her, her defiance, she became a symbol.
She did. People saw her as this dangerous woman, a femme fatale, but also, for some, a symbol of liberation.
And what about Judd? How did they portray him?
At first, they kind of painted him as the victim, this innocent guy seduced by a manipulative woman. But as more details came out, well, public opinion shifted. He became just as guilty in their eyes.
Right.
So their love story, once the secret affair it became public, everyone knew their darkest secrets.
Like their whole world imploded.
Yeah, and the public ate it up. They couldn't get enough of it, all the drama and the scandal.
And the trial itself, it was like a performance, all the dramatic testimony and the emotional outbursts.
It was, and in the end, the jury found them both guilty.
Wow.
They were both sentenced to death.
So their dream life together, it ended on death row.
It did. It's a reminder that our choices have consequences. Even in a time of, supposed freedom and excess, darkness can still win.
Their story is almost 100 years old, but it still has the power to make us think about, the nature of love, what we're willing to do to get what we want, and the price we might pay for it.
It's true. It's a story that stays with you.
I can't imagine what it must have been like, to hear that guilty verdict, to know that this dream of happiness led them to, well, death.
It's true. It's like this stark reminder that there are no shortcuts to happiness and that those transgressions, they come with a price.
A big one in this case.
Yeah, and their dream life, it turned into this nightmare, something even worse than the life they were trying to escape.
It's like something out of a great tragedy.
Yeah, it really is. And then their execution, especially Ruth's. Oh, it became this media circus.
I was just going to ask about that. Like, the public's fascination with the case, it just exploded.
It did. As the execution got closer, the newspapers were going crazy. All these updates about their last meals, their last words.
It's like their lives were laid bare for everyone to see.
Yeah, this public dissection of their sins.
And that photograph of Ruth's execution, it's haunting, isn't it?
It is. It's this raw image of death, and it sparked all these debates about the media, about capital punishment.
It's a reminder of how powerful a single image can be.
Absolutely. It stays with you.
As we're wrapping up, I keep thinking about the Roaring '20s, like you were saying, all that change and anxiety. And this case, it feels like it reflects those tensions, doesn't it?
It does. You have adultery, greed, violence, all these things people were afraid of.
Like it was a warning sign, right? A sign that society was going too far.
Maybe, and the media, they picked up on that. They blew the whole thing up.
In Ruth and Judd's affair, it went from this hidden secret to this national obsession.
Exactly. It shows how, even in a time of progress, the darkness is still there.
It's a story that makes you think about love, about desire, about the choices we make.
And the consequences of those choices.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into this twisted love story.
It was my pleasure.
Don't forget, we have more content over on our YouTube channel, CrimePod Castle. We have crime scene photos, courtroom sketches, even that execution photo we talked about.
Go check it out.
Yeah. And please subscribe to CrimePod Castle and share this episode with your friends. We really appreciate the support.
And join us next time for another episode of Twisted Love. Crimes of Passion. We'll be diving into another story of, love gone wrong.
Stay curious, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.